Good evening, friends, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the captivating and sometimes chilling accounts of history's most formidable figures. Before we begin, a quick thought. If these dark yet mesmerizing tales help you unwind or keep you deliciously unsettled, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps other curious minds discover these haunting histories, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think was the most terrifying ruler of all? Let us know in the comments below, and who you'd like us to explore next in our shadowed chronicles. Tonight, we step into the gilded halls of power, where crowns rest heavy on ruthless brows and ambition knows no mercy. The air is thick with intrigue, whispers of poison, betrayal, and iron. Fisted rule echo through palace corridors. These are the stories of queens who wielded power with a cruelty that still sends shivers down the spine of history. Now, to speak of queens is to summon visions of velvet gloves hiding daggers, of piety masking persecution, of mothers who would sooner blind their sons than share a throne. These women were architects of fear, their reigns painted in blood and fire. But strip away the legend, and their stories are ones of ruthless survival, of what happens when ambition meets absolute power, unchecked by conscience. Of course, their legacies are written in ash and scarlet, the screams of martyrs, the silence of poisoned cups, the cold calculus of political murder. But tonight, we're not just here for the horrors. We're here to trace the paths that led them there, the betrayals that hardened them, the power they craved, and the lines they crossed to keep it. And now, as the night grows still, let's pull back the tapestry of history to meet the women who ruled with terror. This is Bedtime Biographies, and these are the 9 most evil queens the world has ever known. Chapter 1. The Unwanted Princess and Her Grudge. The midwife barely had time to wipe the blood from her hands before Henry came crashing into the chamber, his hunting boots tracking mud across Catherine of Aragon's fine Spanish carpets. He scooped up the squalling February baby with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been waiting 9 months for a living heir. Never mind that this one happened to be a girl. "My pearl!" he bellowed, making the tapestries flutter. The courtiers exchanged glances. This was either going to be the most spoiled child in Christendom or the most disappointed. Mary's nursery looked like a cathedral, and a toy shop had a baby. Venetian glass mobiles tinkled above a crib lined with ermine. Her first rattle was solid silver, because apparently regular wood wasn't fancy enough for the daughter of Europe's most insecure monarch. Catherine, remembering her own strict upbringing, compensated by turning the nursery into what we'd now call an enriched learning environment. If your idea of enrichment includes Latin tutors before breakfast and theology debates with visiting bishops. By age 4, Mary could curtsy, conjugate verbs, and identify every saint in her illuminated prayer book. Her music tutor claimed she had the hands of an angel and the ear of a devil, which sounds impressive until you realize this basically means she was the Tudor equivalent of a kid who corrects your guitar chords at parties. The Spanish ambassador wrote home that she could discuss military strategy better than most generals, though he might have been buttering up Catherine's parents. Henry adored showing off his living proof of virility. During state visits, Mary would perform like a trained parrot, reciting poetry, discoursing on philosophy, or playing the virginals with her tiny feet dangling above the pedals. London's commoners, catching glimpses of the golden-haired princess during processions, called her the Little Queen, and tossed flowers in her path. It was all going so well, which, in Tudor terms, meant disaster was imminent. The cracks started showing when Mary turned 11. Catherine's womb had become a mausoleum of stillbirths, and Henry's eye had wandered to a certain sharp-tongued lady-in-waiting who wore her French hoods at accidentally provocative angles. The king, who once called Mary his pearl, now barely looked at her. First came the separate household for her education, Tudor code for "we're getting rid of you." Then the legal maneuvers, the secret trials, and finally the proclamation declaring her illegitimate. Mary's new life was a masterclass in royal humiliation. The girl who once dined off gold plate now ate from pewter in drafty country houses. Her jewels were confiscated, her servants reduced to 3, and, the ultimate indignity, she was forced to serve in baby Elizabeth's household. Imagine your dad divorces your mum to marry his mistress, then makes you babysit their love child. Tudor family values at their finest. Mary responded with the Tudor equivalent of passive-aggressive sticky notes. She refused to call Elizabeth princess, refused to acknowledge Anne as queen, and scratched Mary Regina into a window pane at Hatfield House, a graffiti tag that can still be seen today. Her stubbornness earned her locked doors and meals of stale bread. Courtiers who once scrambled to carry her train now pretended not to see her. Only her old nurse dared whisper news of Catherine, exiled and dying, writing letters begging Mary to stay strong. When Anne's head rolled off the executioner's block, Mary allowed herself a moment of schadenfreude. But Henry's next wife, Jane Seymour, promptly produced the son he'd always wanted, the sickly Edward. Mary played the dutiful sister, bouncing the baby on her knee while secretly mourning the mother who died alone. The parade of stepmothers that followed, the German Princess Henry found too ugly, the teenager who cheated on him, the widow who outlived him, taught Mary everything about how women survived in Tudor England. Edward VI's reign brought fresh torments. The boy king's Protestant advisers banned the Latin masses Mary loved, replacing ornate rituals with what amounted to Tudor megachurch services. She held secret Catholic rites in her chambers, the smoke of forbidden incense seeping under doors as spies lurked outside. When commissioners came to enforce the reforms, they found Mary kneeling before a crucifix, with her household armed with candlesticks, the 16th century version of "come and take it." The stress manifested in migraines so severe her physicians prescribed powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and emerald potions that tasted like regret. Some nights she dreamed of nursery lullabies, only to wake coughing in a damp bedchamber, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Then came July 1553. A midnight messenger arrived with news that Edward was dead and Lady Jane Grey named Queen. 37 years old, her auburn hair streaked with silver, Mary acted with sudden decisiveness. She rode through the night to rally supporters, her chronic pains forgotten in the rush of destiny. The people remembered Henry's golden girl. Within 9 days, London's streets were strewn with rose petals for the queen they'd never stopped seeing as legitimate. As the crown touched her head at the coronation, Mary closed her eyes against the incense. Not the cheap Protestant stuff, but proper Catholic frankincense that smelled like childhood. The little girl who'd practiced curtsies before mirrors was gone. In her place stood a queen forged by betrayal, ready to drag England back to Rome with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Chapter 2. Bonfire Night. Every night. Mary's coronation procession smelled like roasted chestnuts and religious panic. As her carriage rolled through London in October 1553, the new queen kept sniffing the air like a bloodhound, catching a familiar scent. That wasn't just wood smoke curling from chimneys. It was the sweet perfume of Catholic restoration. After 20 years of Protestant reforms, England was about to get a spiritual enema, and Mary was holding the funnel. Her first parliament moved with the speed of a woman making up for lost time. Within months, she'd repealed all of Edward's religious laws, banned clerical marriage, sorry, fellas, and announced her engagement to Prince Philip of Spain. The English reacted to this news about as well as you'd expect. Imagine telling your dog you're marrying the mailman he bites every day. Rebellions erupted faster than you could say, Spanish Inquisition. The Wyatt Rebellion gave Mary her first taste of royal vengeance. After crushing the revolt, she ordered the execution of Lady Jane Grey, the unfortunate teenager who'd been queen for about as long as a Snapchat streak. As Jane knelt at the block, Mary reportedly wept in her chambers. This would become her signature move, crocodile tears followed by another round of executions. The Queen had discovered the Tudor equivalent of thoughts and prayers. Philip arrived in 1554 with all the subtlety of a bull in a communion wafer factory. His Spanish entourage elbowed aside English courtiers. His confessor started snooping through church affairs, and worst of all, he thought English beer tasted like piss water. Mary, meanwhile, glowed like a teenager at her first prom. She'd convinced herself this political marriage was a love match, writing Philip letters that would make a Harlequin romance editor blush. Then came the burnings. What started as occasional executions of high-profile heretics soon became England's grimmest spectator sport. Mary's bishops set up a theological version of American Idol, where the prize was being roasted alive. First it was just bishops and preachers, then shopkeepers who mumbled the wrong prayer, then elderly women who couldn't remember the new Latin responses. The smoke over Smithfield became so constant, Londoners stopped noticing the smell. The Queen attended some executions personally, watching from a special box like she was at the theatre. Witnesses described her leaning forward eagerly as the flames climbed, her lips moving in prayer. The victims' screams, she believed, were just the sound of souls being purified. It was like medieval ASMR for religious fanatics. Meanwhile, Mary's phantom pregnancy became the Tudor version of a soap opera cliffhanger. For months, she exhibited all the symptoms: morning sickness, swollen belly, even lactation. The royal physicians nodded sagely and prescribed more unicorn horn, still just narwhal tusk. When the due date came and went with no baby, Philip took it as his cue to peace out to Spain. The Queen's belly deflated like a punctured football, leaving only rumors that she'd actually had a tumor. Her health deteriorating, Mary doubled down on the burnings. The death toll climbed past 300, enough people to fill a decent-sized medieval nightclub. London's executioners worked overtime, while the Queen coughed blood into silk handkerchiefs. Even her staunchest supporters began whispering that maybe this was excessive. It's telling when 16th century people think you're overdoing the violence. The final irony came in November 1558. As Mary lay dying at St. James' Palace, her hated half-sister Elizabeth was already practicing her coronation speech. The last sound Mary heard wasn't prayers or weeping courtiers, but the distant cheers of Londoners celebrating her impending death. Her final words, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Even in death, she couldn't stop being extra about her failed French territories. When the news spread, bonfires lit up across England, but this time they were celebratory. The people who'd lived through 5 years of terror now toasted their deliverance with the good Protestant ale Philip had hated so much. Mary's legacy was set. She'd be remembered not as the devout queen who fought for her faith, but as the monarch who turned execution into a public holiday. Not quite the epitaph she'd hoped for when she rode triumphantly into London 5 years earlier. Chapter 3. From Concubine with Killer Ambition. The Tang dynasty's imperial palace in the year 638 smelled of sandalwood, silk, and ruthless ambition. Somewhere between the perfumed corridors and moonlit gardens, a 14-year-old girl named Wu Zhao was shampooing a concubine's hair and plotting how to rule China. Not that anyone noticed to the court. She was just another pretty face in the endless rotation of Keren, the lowest rank of imperial concubines whose duties included back rubs, poetry recitals, and trying not to get poisoned by rivals. Wu had entered the palace through what we might call the backdoor internship program, selected not for noble birth, but for beauty, wit, and that indefinable quality that makes powerful men forget their wives exist. Her father, a wealthy timber merchant, had educated her unusually well for a girl of that era. She could read classical texts, compose poetry, and debate philosophy, skills about as common in Tang concubines as vegetarian tigers. Emperor Taizong noticed this unusually literate shampoo girl. Soon, she was serving his inkstone instead of his concubine's shampoo bowls, a promotion roughly equivalent to going from mailroom clerk to CEO's personal assistant. The emperor nicknamed her Mei Niang, beautiful girl, though court gossips whispered Wu invented the nickname herself. Even then, she was rewriting her origin story like a politician polishing their resume. The palace was a deadly chessboard where pieces disappeared overnight. Wu watched as higher-ranked concubines accidentally swallowed poison or slipped into ponds. She learned the 3 golden rules of survival. 1. Never eat food you didn't see prepared. 2. Always have multiple patrons. And 3. Smile at the women plotting to kill you while memorizing their weaknesses. By 18, she could identify 17 different types of poison just by smell. When Taizong died in 649, custom demanded childless concubines become nuns. As others wept and shaved their heads, Wu saw opportunity. Somehow, the details are hazy, but probably involved strategic seduction. She caught the eye of the new emperor, Gaozong. This was the political equivalent of jumping from a sinking ship directly onto a rising rocket. The scandal should have destroyed her. Instead, it launched her to Zhao Yi status, the concubine equivalent of making VP. Wu's real genius lay in understanding power's intangible currencies. She studied Gaozong's weaknesses, chronic headaches, indecisiveness, and positioned herself as his indispensable advisor. When he struggled with memorials, she'd happen to have insightful suggestions. When ministers argued, she fed him perfect compromises. Soon, the emperor couldn't decide what to eat for breakfast without consulting her. The current empress, Lady Wang, made a fatal miscalculation. Thinking Wu could help displace a rival concubine, she brought her back from the nunnery. It was like releasing a panther to deal with a house cat. Wu promptly accused Lady Wang of murdering her newborn daughter. Never mind that court whispers said Wu might have assisted the infant's demise. The emperor believed his favorite, deposing Wang and crowning Wu as empress in 655. As empress, Wu became Gaozong's shadow regent. When strokes left him half-blind, she interpreted his mumbled words to mean whatever she wanted. She reformed the civil service exams, allowing talented commoners to rise. Her network of informants made the Stasi look like amateur gossips. Yet she also patronized Buddhism, commissioning magnificent temples and cave sculptures that still exist today. By the time Gaozong died in 683, Wu had mastered the art of ruling through intermediaries. She placed 2 sons on the throne in quick succession, removing them when they showed inconvenient independence. When her grandson questioned her authority, she threw a banquet just to publicly tear his name from the imperial registry. The message was clear. In Wu's court, blood meant nothing compared to obedience. In 690, at age 65, Wu did the unthinkable. She declared herself emperor of a new Zhou dynasty, the only woman ever to hold that title in China. The ceremony featured a 100-foot-tall statue of herself as a Buddhist deity, and enough pageantry to make modern dictators blush. The little concubine who'd entered the palace washing hair now wore the dragon robe. Wu's rise wasn't just about seduction or murder. It was about recognizing power's invisible architecture. She knew when to flatter and when to threaten, how to make allies think her ideas were theirs, and most importantly, how to make the impossible seem inevitable. By the time anyone realized what was happening, she'd already rewritten the rules. Chapter 4. The Dragon Throne's Shadow Army. Zetian's grip on power didn't rely on silk gloves. It required an iron fist wrapped in velvet. By the time she declared herself emperor in 690, she'd perfected a surveillance system that would make modern dictators take notes. The control branch wasn't just a secret police force. It was the central nervous system of her empire, with informants slithering through every level of society like venomous snakes in the grass. These weren't your garden variety spies. Wu's agents perfected the art of fishing, casually dropping treasonous remarks in tea houses to see who'd bite. One official learned this the hard way, after drunkenly comparing Wu to the infamous Empress Lu. He woke up in a dungeon missing several fingernails before being paraded through the streets in a kanga, a portable stock that forced him to stand bent double while crowds pelted him with rotten fruit. The torture chambers beneath Luoyang became laboratories of pain. There was the chicken feather tickler, less fun than it sounds, the 5 punishments, a progressive tautsan of amputations and facial tattoos, and the ever-popular asking for confession technique, where suspects knelt under progressively heavier stones until their ribs cracked. Wu's justice operated on a simple principle. Everyone was guilty of something. It was just a matter of finding out what. When dealing with high-profile targets, Wu preferred psychological warfare. The poet Luo Binwang made the mistake of writing a scathing critique of her rule. Rather than executing him, she forced him to publicly recite his work while her scholars picked apart every line. The humiliation broke him more effectively than any torture. Afterward, she magnanimously pardoned him, then had him assigned to clean latrines in the farthest military outpost. Family posed special challenges. Wu's eldest son Li Hong showed worrying signs of independence, so he conveniently died after sharing a meal with her favorite eunuch. Her second son, Li Xian, was caught stockpiling weapons, or perhaps framed by conveniently planted evidence. Either way, he got demoted from crown prince to prisoner in record time. When her daughter-in-law, Lady Liu, started gossiping about these incidents, she found herself imprisoned in a palace that mysteriously caught fire. The infamous case of Wu's infant daughter remains history's juiciest cold case. Did she really smother her own baby to frame Empress Wang? Contemporary sources whisper yes, but Wu's defenders suggest the child might have died naturally, and the ambitious concubine simply capitalized on the tragedy. Either way, the incident showcased her ruthless pragmatism. In the Game of Thrones, even cribs could become chessboards. Wu's network extended beyond the grave. She maintained dossiers on every official's family, their marriages, debts, even what they joked about at banquets. When Minister Zhou accidentally compared her policies to trying to stop a flood with teacups, she waited 3 years to punish him, precisely when his son was up for promotion. The message was clear. Her memory was longer than the Great Wall. Yet this terror had method. Wu's spies kept corruption in check. Officials were too terrified to steal so much as an inkstone. Her secret police crushed aristocratic factions that had plagued the Tang dynasty for generations. And when a genuine conspiracy arose in 698, her networks uncovered it before the plotters could sharpen their swords. In her final years, Wu's paranoia became self-fulfilling. She slept in different chambers each night, tasted by multiple servants. Even her beloved precious duck, a young lover, vanished after boasting too loudly about his influence. When she finally fell from power at 80, the system she'd built unraveled within months, but the fear she'd instilled lingered for generations. Modern intelligence agencies could learn from Wu's playbook. She understood that true power isn't just about violence, but about controlling the narrative, making people believe you're omniscient, even when you're not. In the end, Her shadow army's greatest weapon wasn't torture chambers or spies, but the creeping dread that made every whisper feel like a treasonous act. Chapter 5. Madagascar's Own Iron Lady. The highlands of Madagascar in the late 18th century smelled of vanilla and volcanic dust when a girl named Ramavo entered the world. Though no trumpets sounded for this daughter of a provincial nobleman, her childhood unfolded in the shadow of Imerina's rolling hills, where she learned early that survival required both the grace of a diplomat and the cunning of a crocodile. Little did anyone suspect this quiet child would one day hold a kingdom's fate in her hands. Ramavo's father, Prince Andrian Salamanjaka, belonged to the lower nobility, important enough to matter, but not so prominent as to attract dangerous attention. From him, she learned the delicate art of political navigation in a kingdom where royal favor could vanish faster than morning mist. Her mother schooled her in the sacred Kabari oratory tradition, where every pause and gesture carried meaning. By 12, Ramavo could deliver speeches so polished they made village elders weep. The turning point came in 1810, when King Andrian Ampoinimerina needed political insurance. Seeking to unite warring factions, he arranged a marriage between his son Radama and young Ramavo, now renamed Ranavalona, the kept one, to signify her new role as human peace treaty. The ceremony lasted 9 days, featuring enough zebu sacrifices to feed the entire court, and rituals so elaborate, even the priests got confused. As crown princess, Ranavalona observed court politics with the intensity of a chess master studying opening moves. She noted how Radama's progressive policies, welcoming European traders, embracing Christianity, alienated conservative nobles. She watched missionaries dismantle ancestral traditions, while foreign merchants grew fat on Malagasy resources, and she bided her time, accumulating allies among the displaced traditionalists who saw her as their last hope. When Radama died suddenly in 1828, after a brief, mysterious illness, the kingdom held its breath. The king had named no clear successor, and European powers already circled like vultures. But Ranavalona moved with precision, securing support from the army, outmaneuvering rival claimants, and presenting herself as the guardian of Malagasy sovereignty. Her coronation ceremony, conducted according to ancient Marina rites rather than Christian custom, sent an unmistakable message: Madagascar would chart its own course. The new queen's first acts revealed her political philosophy in microcosm. She reinstated traditional advisors Radama had dismissed. She ordered the royal idols, packed away during her husband's Christian phase, ceremonially restored. Yet she also kept useful European innovations like firearms and modern medicine, proving her pragmatism. This wasn't blind traditionalism, but careful cultural triage, keeping what strengthened Madagascar while discarding what weakened it. Ranavalona understood power's theater. She adopted the name Ranavalomanjaka, the exalted one who rules, dressing in silver-threaded lamber cloth that shimmered like water under moonlight. Her public appearances became masterclasses in political symbolism, 1 minute presiding over ancestral spirit ceremonies, the next reviewing troops with European-style drills. The message was clear. This queen would define Madagascar's future on her own terms. By the time the first European envoys arrived, to test the new monarch, they found a ruler fully in command. When British agents demanded trade concessions, Ranavalona countered with a discourse on Malagasy sovereignty, so eloquent the interpreters stumbled. French merchants, expecting a pliable widow, instead encountered a woman who quoted their own Enlightenment philosophers back at them. The little girl from the provinces had become Madagascar's Iron Lady. Those early years laid the foundation for what would become one of history's most remarkable reigns. Ranavalona's childhood in the political margins had taught her to read shifting allegiances like weather patterns. Her marriage provided an education in statecraft, and her widowhood revealed the steel beneath the silk, a quality that would soon make her both feared and revered across the island. Chapter 6. A Royal Poison Penchant. The crown weighed heavier than Ranavalona expected. Not the physical gold and gems, those sat comfortably enough, but the sheer responsibility of reshaping an entire kingdom in her image. The young widow who had seized power now faced the harder task, keeping it. And she had ideas. So many ideas. Her first order of business involved the Europeans who'd been sniffing around Madagascar like merchants at a spice market. The missionaries who had tutored her in languages and diplomacy suddenly found their welcome wearing thin. What had been useful allies during her rise now looked like potential threats. Their Bibles began disappearing from court. Their schools found themselves suddenly without students. Then, in 1835, she made it official. Christianity was banned. Not restricted, not discouraged, but outlawed with the finality of a slamming door. The punishment for conversion? Death, naturally, but not the quick, clean sort. Ranavalona preferred her executions with theatrical flair. Some converts found themselves tossed from the cliffs at Ambohimanga, their bodies left to tumble down the sacred rocks. Others were bound and drowned in the sacred waters where their ancestors had once prayed. The message was clear. Madagascar would remain Malagasy, even if every last drop of foreign blood had to be spilled to keep it that way. Then came the Tangina trials. The ancient ordeal had been used for centuries, but Ranavalona elevated it to an art form. The accused would swallow poison extracted from the Tangina nut mixed with chicken skin. If they vomited within the hour, their innocence was proven. If not, well, the royal physicians had plenty of experience documenting convulsions. The Queen attended these trials, like others might attend the theater, watching with quiet fascination as justice played out in spasms and bile. Her construction projects reshaped the island's landscape. The Queen demanded roads where there had been footpaths, fortresses where there had been villages. Thousands of forced laborers hauled stones under the tropical sun, their backs spent beneath the weight of her ambition. When workers collapsed, others took their place. When villages resisted, providing laborers, soldiers arrived to encourage cooperation. The bones of the unwilling became part of Madagascar's new foundations. The royal palace at Antananarivo grew like a living thing, its wooden walls expanding year by year. Craftsmen carved intricate panels, depicting the Queen's victories, while slaves polished the floors until they shone like still water. Visitors from neighboring kingdoms marveled at its splendor, carefully avoiding mention of the missing nobles who might have once stood where they now walked. Ranavalona's isolationist policies turned Madagascar into a fortress. Foreign ships found their trade goods refused at port. The few Europeans, still clinging to their missions, watched helplessly as their influence evaporated like morning mist. The Queen established a system of internal spies who reported any whisper of foreign sympathy. Soon, even speaking a European language could earn a visit from the royal guards. Her personal life proved equally dramatic. The Queen took multiple husbands after her first died, though none lasted long. Some succumbed to illness, others to accidents. A few simply disappeared from court records as if they'd never existed. Each departure left her more firmly in control, her power unquestioned, her authority absolute. The years passed in a rhythm of purges and pageantry. Every dry season brought new construction projects. Every rainy season washed the blood from execution grounds. The Queen aged, but her grip on power never wavered. When her son Rakoto showed signs of European sympathies, she had his tutors executed. When nobles murmured about succession, she reminded them who ruled with carefully timed disappearances. By the 1850s, Madagascar stood utterly transformed. Where there had been trade routes, there were now barriers. Where there had been Christian churches, there were only ashes. The island's population had dwindled under the combined weight of executions, forced labor, and fleeing refugees. But it was hers, undeniably, irrevocably hers. In her final years, Ranavalona grew more unpredictable. She ordered entire villages relocated on whims. She banned certain colors from being worn in her presence. She took to walking the palace halls at night, her bare feet silent on the polished wood, listening for whispers that weren't there. When death finally came in 1861, it found a queen who had outlived most of her contemporaries. The woman who had ruled Madagascar for 33 years left behind a kingdom both stronger and weaker than she'd found it, fiercely independent but bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. Her son Rakoto would try to undo some of her policies, but the scars ran deep. The poison had already seeped into Madagascar's soil. Ranavalona's legacy defies simple judgment. Was she a tyrant? Undoubtedly. A visionary? Perhaps. A woman who shaped her world with ruthless determination? Absolutely. History remembers her as the queen who chose isolation over influence, tradition over change, and her own will over all others. In that, at least, she succeeded completely. Chapter 7. Beauty Tips from a Blood Bank. So, we left Elizabeth Bathory in her rather grand, if somewhat draughty, Hungarian castle, a woman of immense power, wealth, and a certain, shall we say, reputation that was just beginning to bubble like a poorly attended cauldron. The whispers had started as faint murmurs, the kind of local gossip that might get traded over a tankard of questionable ale. But soon, those whispers would crescendo into a full-blown symphony of horror, painting a picture so grotesque it would make gargoyles blush. This, dear listener, is where the velvet gloves come off and the, well, other, much less pleasant implements, allegedly, came out. Forget the polite courtly dances and the strategic marriages of Chapter 7. We are now wading rather unsteadily into the crimson tide of accusations that cemented Elizabeth Bathory as a household name, and not in the hostess with the mostest kind of way. The shift from respected, if somewhat feared, noble woman to the monster of Cixi wasn't an overnight transformation, or at least the discovery of it wasn't. For years, rumors had been circulating among the peasantry, tales of young women entering the castle gates, bright-eyed, and perhaps a little nervous about their new jobs, only to vanish as if spirited away by the night itself. Local villagers, it said, grew increasingly uneasy. Their daughters, sent to work for the Countess, would send back glowing reports of fine food and easy living for a few weeks, and then silence. A silence more chilling than any winter wind whistling through the Carpathian mountains. It's one thing to lose a hairpin, it's quite another to misplace a statistically significant portion of the local serving girl population. The official inquiries didn't kick off with pitchfork-wielding peasants, though one can imagine their patience was wearing thinner than a beggar's cloak. No, the impetus, as is so often the case with the powerful, came when the alleged victims started to climb the social ladder. It was one thing, apparently, to mistreat or even dispatch girls of common birth. But when the daughters of lesser nobles, sent to Elizabeth's household for a bit of aristocratic polishing, also began to disappear or return, damaged, let's say, people with slightly more influential letterheads began to take notice. King Matthias II himself eventually ordered an investigation, led by a rather determined fellow named György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary. Think of him as a sort of 16th century special investigator, only with more ermine and fewer DNA kits. Thurzó and his men descended upon Cixi Castle in December of 1610, and what they reportedly found, according to the subsequent testimonies, was less a noble residence and more a charnel house with a rather impressive wine cellar. The accounts that emerged from this investigation, drawn from surviving victims, witnesses, and even some of Elizabeth's own household staff, painted a truly gruesome picture. We're talking about a veritable catalogue of cruelty, a how-to guide for aspiring supervillains, allegedly penned in the daily actions of the Countess and her inner circle of helpers. These weren't just casual acts of brutality. They were described as systematic, almost ritualistic torments. Let's talk about these alleged accomplices for a moment. Because a queen of cruelty, it seems, rarely reigns alone. There was Dorothea Sentes, often called Dorka, a woman described as an older, hardened servant. Then there was Ilona Jo, the girl's nurse, and a certain Fixco, a young manservant. Most sinister, perhaps, was the rumored influence of a woman named Anna Darvulia, a supposed occultist or dark magic practitioner who, some stories claim, mentored Elizabeth in the more esoteric arts of cruelty, before conveniently dying a few years before the investigation. It's always handy when your evil guru exits stage left before the authorities arrive, isn't it? These individuals were said to be the Countess's hands, the ones who carried out the beatings, the bindings, and the more inventive punishments. The testimonies collected by Thurzó's investigators were nothing short of horrific. Young women, hundreds of them according to the eventual charges, were said to have been subjected to tortures that would make a seasoned inquisitor take notes. We hear of girls being beaten with clubs, and heavy cudgels, sometimes for days, until their flesh was pulp. Needles were a recurring theme, stuck under fingernails, into lips and other sensitive areas. Imagine a sewing circle run by a demon with a grudge against humanity. There were claims of hands being burned, of flesh being bitten off faces and limbs by the Countess herself, in fits of rage. Some were allegedly forced to stand outside in the freezing cold, doused with water until they became human ice sculptures, a truly chilling new take on garden statuary. The reasons for these supposed outbursts of violence were often described as chillingly trivial: a poorly arranged hairpin, a perceived slight, a task not performed quickly enough. It's as if the Countess operated on a hair-trigger temper, and her preferred method of stress relief involved inflicting unimaginable suffering. One witness, a former servant, claimed that Elizabeth kept a detailed journal, meticulously recording the names and fates of her victims. This legendary diary, supposedly listing over 650 names, became a cornerstone of her monstrous reputation, though its actual existence and contents are subjects of much historical debate. 650. That's not just a crime spree. It's a small-scale depopulation effort. And then, of course, there's the legend, the one that truly cemented Elizabeth Bathory in the annals of Gothic horror, the bloodbaths. The story goes that the Countess, noticing one day that her skin seemed smoother and more youthful, where a servant girl's blood had accidentally spattered it, had a monstrous epiphany. If a little blood could do that, imagine what a full immersion could achieve. And so, according to the legend, young women were systematically bled, their vital fluids collected so that the aging Countess could bathe in their blood, seeking to reclaim her lost youth and beauty. It's the ultimate ghoulish spa treatment, a beauty regimen straight out of a vampire's daydreams. Now, historians tend to be a bit skeptical about the literal truth of the bloodbaths. There's not a lot of concrete contemporary evidence from the trial testimonies explicitly detailing full immersion bathing. It's more likely that this particularly lurid detail was an embellishment, a bit of Gothic frosting on an already very dark cake, perhaps popularized by later writers and storytellers. After all, Countess who tortured people is grim, but Countess who bathes in the blood of virgins to stay young. Now, that has cinematic potential. It taps into ancient fears of aging, the corrupting influence of vanity, and the terrifying lengths to which someone might go to preserve their power and appearance. It's a powerful, enduring image, even if it's more folklore than fact. What is less debated is the sheer terror that Elizabeth Bathory inspired, and the horrifying nature of the accusations leveled against her by dozens, if not hundreds, of witnesses. The investigation by Thurzo culminated in the arrest of Elizabeth and her key servants in late 1610 and early 1611. Her accomplices Dorka, Ilona, and Fitchcore were put on trial. Their confessions, likely extracted under torture, because irony is apparently a 16th century specialty, detailed horrific acts. They were found guilty and executed in rather gruesome fashions. Fingers torn off before being burned alive, that sort of thing. The justice of the time was not known for its subtlety. Elizabeth herself, however, due to her noble status and powerful family connections, was never subjected to a formal public trial. Imagine the scandal. A Bathory, related to kings and princes, dragged through a public spectacle. Instead, she was effectively placed under house arrest, confined to her castle at Cixi. Some accounts say she was walled up in a suite of rooms, with only small slits left for food and water to be passed through. There, in the very place where she had allegedly lorded over her kingdom of pain, she would live out the remaining years of her life, a prisoner in her own fortress of fear. Whether she spent those years reflecting on her alleged deeds, or merely fuming at the inconvenience of it all, we'll never know. But the stories, those dark, bloody, and undeniably captivating stories, would ensure that Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, would achieve a terrible kind of immortality. Her beauty tips, thankfully, did not catch on. Chapter 9. The Italian Spider in the French Court. All right, settle in, because we're leaving the blood-soaked castles of Eastern Europe and flitting across to the altogether more perfumed, but no less treacherous, courts of 16th century France. Our next leading lady is a name synonymous with political maneuvering, queenly endurance, and a rather unfortunate association with a very nasty wedding party. We're talking, of course, about Catherine de Medici. Before she became the stuff of dark legends and Huguenot nightmares, she was an Italian heiress, a slightly out-of-place bride, and a woman who learned to spin webs of influence with the patience and skill of a spider in a room full of very large, very clumsy flies. This is the story of her ascent, the making of the Italian queen in the French court, long before things got messier. Catherine de' Medici was born in Florence in 1519, a product of the fabulously wealthy and influential Medici banking family. Think less old money, and more invented the concept of money, and then made a mountain of it kind of family. Despite the glittering name, her early life wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Orphaned within weeks of her birth, little Catherine became a very valuable and very vulnerable political pawn. Her uncle just happened to be Pope Clement VII, which in those days was like having a celestial CEO in the family. A lot of power, a lot of enemies, and a direct line to negotiating some rather hefty deals. Like, say, a marriage alliance with a major European power. And that's precisely what happened. In 1533, at the tender age of 14, Catherine was shipped off to France to marry Henry, the Duke of Orleans, who was the second son of King Francis I. Imagine being a teenager, packed off to a foreign country where you barely speak the language, to marry a prince you've never met, all while carrying the expectations of your very powerful, very Italian family on your small shoulders. Oh, and the French court? Not exactly known for its warm embrace of outsiders, especially Italian ones who many French nobles sniffily regarded as jumped-up merchants with too much cash and not enough ancient lineage. Talk about a tough crowd. Her early years in France were challenging. That's putting it mildly. For one thing, her husband Henry was utterly besotted with his mistress, the famously beautiful and considerably older Diane de Poitiers. Catherine was the dutiful wife, the one legally bound to produce heirs, while Diane was the one who held the Dauphin's heart, and a good chunk of his political attention too. For 10 long years, Catherine failed to conceive, a perilous situation for any royal wife in an era when a queen's primary job description was be fruitful and multiply, preferably with sons. The pressure must have been immense. You can almost picture her, quietly observing, learning the subtle currents of the court, the whispers in the corridors, the way power ebbed and flowed like the tides. She was playing the long game, even if she didn't know it yet. Then, almost as if a switch had been flipped, the heirs started arriving, 10 children in 12 years. Suddenly, Catherine wasn't just the Italian import. She was the mother of future kings, a position that afforded her a new level of security and respect, even if her husband's affections still lay firmly with Diane. She endured. She watched. She learned. She was, in essence, in a decades-long masterclass in courtly survival and power dynamics, taught by the very people who often sought to sideline her. Every snub, every public appearance of Diane de Poitiers dripping in jewels that perhaps should have been Catherine's, was another lesson in patience and the careful cultivation of influence. The real turning point, the moment the spider truly began to spin her own intricate web, came in 1559, with the sudden, shocking death of her husband, King Henry II. One minute he was jousting in a celebratory tournament. The next he had a very large splinter of a lance in his eye. And shortly thereafter, France had a new, very young king, Catherine's 15-year-old son, Francis II. And just like that, Catherine de' Medici transformed from the overshadowed queen consort into the queen mother, a figure of immense potential power. The king was young, frail, and heavily influenced by his wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, and her powerful Guise uncles. But Catherine was there, a constant presence, her decades of observation ready to be put into action. Francis II's reign was short. He died just a year later, and Catherine's second son, Charles IX, ascended the throne at the ripe old age of 10. This was Catherine's moment. She was declared regent, or at least the principal power behind her young son. Now, France in the mid-16th century wasn't exactly a tranquil place. It was being torn apart by the wars of religion, a bitter and bloody conflict between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. It was into this hornet's nest of sectarian violence and political intrigue that Catherine stepped, determined to preserve the authority of the crown and the Valois dynasty, which meant preserving her sons. And this is where Catherine truly began to show her political acumen. She wasn't a warrior queen. Her weapons were diplomacy, manipulation, and an uncanny ability to play factions off against each other. She organized grand festivals and entertainments, not just for fun, but as a way to bring warring nobles together, to distract them, to remind them of the splendor and power of the monarchy. Think of it as extreme party planning as a tool of statecraft. She initiated policies of religious toleration, attempting to find a middle ground, a way for Catholics and Huguenots to coexist, however grudgingly. These efforts often failed, or were temporary at best, but they showcased her pragmatism. She wasn't necessarily driven by deep religious conviction herself. Her religion was the stability of France and the security of her children on its throne. She cultivated a network of informants, her flying squadron of beautiful and intelligent ladies, in waiting, who, according to rumor, were adept at extracting secrets from susceptible courtiers. While likely exaggerated for dramatic effect, it speaks to her reputation for knowing everything that happened in her court. She was a shrewd negotiator, always looking for an angle, a compromise, a way to turn a dangerous situation to her advantage. Some called her indecisive, others duplicitous. Perhaps she was simply a survivor, a political tightrope walker in an age where a single misstep could mean disaster for herself, her family, and the entire kingdom. She was weaving, always weaving, trying to hold together a country that seemed determined to rip itself apart, all while consolidating her own and her son's grip on the slippery reins of power. The stage was being set, the tensions were rising, and Catherine, the Italian spider, was at the very center of it all, blissfully unaware, perhaps, of the blood-red threads that would soon dominate the pattern. Chapter 10. The Parisian Wedding Massacre. We left Catherine de' Medici, the Italian spider, deftly weaving her webs of influence in the French court, trying to hold together a kingdom perpetually on the brink of tearing itself apart. She was the master manipulator, the queen of political expediency, always with an eye on protecting her sons and the Valois crown. But even the most skilled spider can get caught in a truly horrific tangle. And for Catherine, that tangle would become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, an event so bloody, so infamous, it would forever stain her name and overshadow decades of careful maneuvering. So, take a deep breath, because this is where the carefully constructed facade of uneasy peace shatters into a million crimson pieces. The year was 1572. In a bid to finally mend the gaping wound between French Catholics and Protestant Huguenots, a grand wedding was arranged. Catherine's own daughter, Marguerite de Valois, a Catholic princess, was to marry Henry of Navarre, a leading Huguenot, and future King of France himself. Imagine the scene. Paris, decked out in its finest, a city buzzing with nobles from both factions, all gathered for what was supposed to be a symbol of unity. It was the political equivalent of forcing two mortal enemies to be roommates and hoping they'd bond over who left the cap off the toothpaste. Optimistic, to say the least. The guest list was a who's who of the Huguenot leadership, all conveniently gathered in one very Catholic, very tense city. What could possibly go wrong? Well, for a few days, not much. There were feasts, dances, and all the usual royal wedding brouhaha. But the air was thick with suspicion, like a bad perfume you just can't get rid of. Then, on August 22nd, just 4 days after the wedding vows were exchanged, an assassin's bullet struck Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most respected and influential Huguenot leader. He wasn't killed, not yet, but he was wounded. Suddenly, the festive atmosphere curdled. The Huguenots were outraged, demanding justice and suspecting the hand of the powerful Catholic Guise family, or perhaps even someone higher up. Fingers, as they often did in times of trouble, began to point towards Catherine and her son, King Charles IX. What happened next is a murky, horrifying descent into chaos. and Catherine's precise role has been debated by historians for centuries. The official story, or at least the one that emerged from the royal camp, was that faced with an imminent Huguenot plot to take revenge for Coligny's attack and possibly seize power, the King's Council made a desperate, preemptive decision. The plan? To eliminate the Huguenot leaders before they could strike. A sort of surgical strike, if your idea of surgery involves a city-wide bloodbath. Was Catherine the architect of this grim plan? Was she a reluctant participant, pushed by more extreme Catholic factions and a panicking son? Or was she, as some argue, trying to manage an already explosive situation that simply spun wildly out of control? The truth is probably a messy combination of all those things. Catherine was, above all, a pragmatist, fiercely protective of her son's throne. If she believed the Huguenot leadership posed an immediate threat to that throne, it's conceivable she would have countenanced their removal. The black legend of Catherine, popularized by her enemies, paints her as a cold, calculating monster, gleefully plotting the slaughter. More nuanced views suggest a woman cornered, making terrible choices in a climate of extreme fear and paranoia. It's less evil genius and more desperate improvisation with catastrophic consequences. On the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24th, 1572, the killing began. Admiral de Coligny was among the first to die, brutally murdered in his bed, his body defenestrated onto the Parisian cobblestones below, a rather unsubtle message. Then the signal was given, perhaps by the tolling of church bells, and the organized assassination of Huguenot leaders escalated into a full-blown massacre. Militias, royal guards, and ordinary Catholic citizens, fueled by religious hatred and mob hysteria, hunted down Huguenots throughout Paris. Houses were broken into. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets. The Seine River, it was said, ran red with blood. It was less a battle and more an extermination. The horror wasn't confined to Paris. As news of the massacres spread, similar waves of violence erupted in other French cities and towns, lasting for weeks, even months. Estimates of the dead vary wildly, from a few thousand to tens of thousands across France. It was a national trauma, an event that horrified Protestant Europe and even shocked some Catholics with its brutality. And Catherine de' Medici, whether by direct order or by fatal miscalculation, found herself inextricably linked to it. Her attempts at reconciliation, her years of carefully balancing factions, all went up in the smoke of burning Huguenot homes. Beyond the massacre itself, Catherine's reputation for evil schemes was also fed by persistent rumors of her use of poisons. The Italian art of poisoning was a popular and terrifying trope in 16th century Europe, and Catherine, being both Italian and powerful, was a natural target for such accusations. Did she really have a secret cabinet of toxins, dispatching her enemies with a subtly poisoned glove or a tainted fig? There's little concrete proof. But in an age of sudden illnesses and high mortality rates, poison was an easy explanation for any inconvenient death, and Catherine's enemies were more than happy to perpetuate the image of her as a scheming poisoner. It added to her mystique, her aura of dangerous, unseen power. Her use of political manipulation and espionage, however, is far better documented. She was a mistress of information, of knowing who was saying what to whom. Her famed flying squadron of ladies, in waiting while perhaps not the honey-trap spies of lurid fiction, were certainly part of her intelligence network, keeping her informed of court gossip and political undercurrents. She understood that knowledge was power, and in the treacherous world of the French court, you needed all the power you could get. She made and unmade alliances, shifted her support, always with the goal of maintaining Valois control. It wasn't always pretty, and it certainly wasn't always moral by our standards, but it was the art of survival in a brutal age. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, however, became her defining moment, the act for which she is most remembered and most condemned. It didn't end the wars of religion. If anything, it made them more bitter and prolonged. For Catherine, it was a catastrophic political failure, even if she perceived it as a grim necessity at the time. The spider who had so skillfully navigated the complexities of the French court found her web drenched in blood, and her name forever linked not just with cunning, but with a night of almost unimaginable horror. The Parisian wedding was over, and the hangover would last for generations. Chapter 11. The Most Catholic Queen's Iron Will. Right then, let's pack our bags and bid adieu to the perfumed treacheries of the French court, because we're heading south to the sun-baked plains of 15th century Spain. Our next leading lady is a queen whose piety was as legendary as her resolve, a woman who forged a nation with a will of steel and a faith that could, quite literally, move mountains, or at least move anyone who didn't quite fit her vision of a unified, devoutly Catholic Spain. Meet Isabella I of Castile, a name that resonates with conquest, exploration, and a rather uncompromising approach to religious homogeneity. But before the shadows of the Inquisition lengthen, let's look at the young princess who fought her way to a throne and dreamed of a single, glorious Spain under one God. Isabella was born in 1451 in the rather quaintly named Madrigal de las Altas Torres, Madrigal of the High Towers. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Her early life, however, wasn't all serenades and siestas. She was the daughter of John II of Castile, but her path to the throne was about as straightforward as a labyrinth designed by a very confused minotaur. Her older half-brother, Henry IV, inherited the crown, and let's just say Henry's reign was complicated. He was known rather unkindly as Henry the Impotent, a nickname that cast serious doubts on the legitimacy of his own daughter, Juana, who was widely rumored to be the child of his wife and a court favorite, Beltrán de la Cueva, hence Juana's charming moniker, Juana la Beltraneja. Politics back then was clearly a full-contact sport with a heavy emphasis on below-the-belt gossip. Young Isabella and her younger brother Alfonso were largely kept out of the political limelight initially, living a relatively quiet life with their mother. But as Henry's reign faltered and the legitimacy of Juana la Beltranea became a massive political football, various factions of Castilian nobles began to look for alternatives. Isabella, with her clear royal lineage and, importantly, her perceived piety and strong character, started to look like a rather attractive candidate. She was deeply religious from a young age, a faith that would become the bedrock of her reign and her personal identity. It wasn't just a Sunday morning affair for Isabella. It was the operating system for her entire life. The fight for the Castilian throne was a messy business. There were civil wars, betrayals, and enough political maneuvering to make your head spin. Isabella's brother, Alfonso, was briefly proclaimed king by rebellious nobles, but his early death put Isabella front and center as the main rival to Henry and his daughter, Juana. Isabella was no shrinking violet. She was shrewd, determined, and possessed an iron will that would define her rule. She navigated the treacherous waters of Castilian politics with a skill that belied her youth, refusing to be married off to unsuitable candidates chosen by her brother, and instead taking matters into her own hands. And that brings us to her marriage, one of the most consequential unions in European history. In 1469, against her half-brother Henry's wishes, Isabella secretly married Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Aragon. This wasn't just a love match, though by all accounts they developed a strong partnership. This was a power move of epic proportions. Castile and Aragon were the two largest kingdoms in Iberia. Their union, under Isabella and Ferdinand, often called the Catholic monarchs, laid the foundation for a unified Spain. It was like merging two rival supercorporations, but with more crowns and fewer PowerPoint presentations. When Henry IV finally kicked the royal bucket in 1474, Isabella wasted no time. She had herself proclaimed Queen of Castile. Of course, Juana la Beltranea and her supporters, backed by Portugal, weren't about to just hand over the crown jewels. What followed was the War of the Castilian Succession. It was a tough fight, but Isabella, with Ferdinand by her side, showed her mettle. She was actively involved, even appearing on horseback to rally her troops, a rather uncommon sight for a queen of that era. She was demonstrating that she wasn't just a figurehead. She was a leader, a warrior queen in her own right, driven by her conviction that God was on her side, and that the throne of Castile was hers, by divine and earthly right. By 1479, the war was over, and Isabella's claim was secured. Now, she and Ferdinand could get down to the business of ruling and reforming their joined kingdoms. Their motto, Tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, essentially meant they amount to the same, Isabella as much as Ferdinand, emphasizing their equal partnership, though in practice, Isabella held the primary authority in Castile. They embarked on an ambitious program to centralize power, curb the influence of unruly nobles, reform the administration, and crucially, to complete the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to reclaim Iberian territory from the Moorish kingdoms in the south. Isabella's vision for Spain was one of unity, political, religious, and cultural. Her devout Catholicism wasn't just a personal faith, it was a cornerstone of her state-building project. She saw a strong, unified Catholic Spain as her divine mission. This period saw the establishment of a more assertive royal authority, the promotion of Spanish language and culture, and of course, the patronage of a certain Genoese explorer named Christopher Columbus, whose voyage in 1492 would accidentally stumble upon a couple of continents and change the world forever. Isabella's decision to fund Columbus, after much deliberation, showed her willingness to take calculated risks for potentially great rewards, all in the service of enhancing Spain's power and spreading the Catholic faith. It's important to remember this phase of her rule, the forging of a nation, the assertion of royal authority, the almost fanatical devotion to her faith that she believed was guiding her every move. She was seen by many of her subjects as a just and powerful ruler, a restorer of order, a champion of Catholicism. But this same iron will, this same fervent religious zeal that fueled her rise and her nation-building, also contained the seeds of the darker aspects of her reign. The drive for unity, when combined with an uncompromising faith, would soon lead to policies that, while perhaps seen by Isabella as necessary for the spiritual health of her kingdom, would bring immense suffering to many. The stage was set, the most Catholic queen was firmly on her throne, and her iron will was about to be tested, and tested upon her people. Chapter 12. Her Majesty's Inquisition Holiday. So, Queen Isabella I was firmly ensconced on the throne of Castile, her partnership with Ferdinand of Aragon forging a new, powerful Spain. We've seen her iron will, her devout faith, and her knack for nation-building. But as we know, dear listeners, power, especially when mixed with an unshakable conviction of one's own righteousness, can lead down some very dark and rather smoky paths. Now we turn the page from the forging of a kingdom to the, let's call it, purification of that kingdom, Isabella style. And when Isabella decided it was time for a spiritual spring cleaning, she didn't just dust the shelves. She brought out the heavy artillery of the Holy Office, more famously known as the Spanish Inquisition. Buckle up, because Her Majesty's Inquisition holiday was anything but a vacation for those deemed out of step. The ink was barely dry on the treaties securing Isabella's crown when, in 1478, at the persistent urging of the monarchs, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull authorizing them to establish an inquisition in Castile. Now, inquisitions weren't new. They'd been around in various forms for centuries, designed to root out heresy. But the Spanish Inquisition, under the direct control of Isabella and Ferdinand, would become a uniquely powerful and notoriously brutal institution. A state-controlled religious police force, if you will. Its primary targets? Conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, but who were suspected of secretly practicing their ancestral faith. It seems you could check out of Judaism, but you could never truly leave, not in the eyes of some. Why the obsession with conversos? Well, in Isabella's vision of a unified Catholic Spain, there was little room for religious diversity, or even the suspicion of it. Conversos, despite their baptism, were often viewed with deep distrust by old Christians. They were accused of being insincere in their faith, of Judaizing in secret, and of forming a kind of fifth column within Christian society. Plus, many conversos were successful in trade, finance, and the professions, which, as history often shows, is a great way to attract resentment and envy from those less fortunate or more traditional. So, the Inquisition was set up to investigate, to interrogate, and to reconcile these suspected heretics with the Church, or, if they proved stubborn, to hand them over to the secular authorities. for a slightly warmer form of reconciliation. The process was, to put it mildly, terrifying. Accusations could be made anonymously. The accused had little right to know who their accusers were, or even, sometimes, the specific charges against them. Defense lawyers were a bit of a novelty, and if you got one, they often advised you to confess anyway because, well, it was generally healthier in the long run. Torture, while supposedly used only to extract a confession when guilt was already strongly suspected, became a common tool. Think waterboarding, the rack, the strappado, a delightful selection of persuasive techniques designed to make you see the error of your ways, or at least say whatever your interrogators wanted to hear. It's amazing how a little bit of stretching can really broaden your theological horizons. Those found guilty and unrepentant faced the auto da fe, the act of faith. This was a public spectacle, a religious festival of sorts, where the condemned were paraded, their sentences read out, and then those destined for the ultimate punishment were handed over to be burned at the stake. Burning was reserved for relapsed heretics or those who refused to recant, the idea being that fire would purify the soul, or at least provide a very memorable warning to anyone else thinking of straying from the one true path. Isabella, it said, attended some of these events, her presence underscoring the solemn religious duty she believed she was performing. One wonders if she brought snacks, or if that would have been considered gauche. And who was the man chosen to lead this holy endeavor? None other than Tomás de Torquemada, a name that has become virtually synonymous with religious fanaticism and cruelty. As the Grand Inquisitor, Torquemada oversaw the expansion and systematization of the Inquisition, turning it into a ruthlessly efficient machine for sniffing out and punishing heresy. He was, by all accounts, a man of austere personal habits and unbending zeal, Isabella's confessor, and someone who shared her vision of a purely Catholic Spain. He was, you might say, the ultimate HR manager for Spain's spiritual workforce, with a rather extreme policy for dealing with underperforming souls. But Isabella's drive for religious uniformity didn't stop with the Conversos. In 1492, a year that was already pretty busy with Columbus sailing the ocean blue and the final conquest of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra Decree. This edict gave Spain's Jewish population a stark choice: convert to Christianity or leave the country within 4 months. No third option. Pack your bags, abandon your homes and businesses, or abandon your faith. It was a brutal act of religious cleansing, resulting in the exodus of tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of Sephardic Jews from Spain, a community that had lived and thrived there for centuries. The reasoning? The decree stated that the presence of practicing Jews was a constant temptation for conversos to relapse into Judaism, a sort of spiritual bad influence. So, for the good of the conversos' souls and the overall religious health of the kingdom, the entire Jewish community had to go. It was like blaming the bakery for your inability to stick to a diet, and then burning down the bakery. The expulsion was a human tragedy and a significant economic blow to Spain, though Isabella likely saw it as a necessary sacrifice for the greater glory of God and the spiritual purity of her realm. Later, a similar ultimatum would be given to Spain's Muslim population. After the conquest of Granada, They were initially promised religious freedom. But that promise, like so many political promises, had an expiration date. By the early 16th century, they too faced the choice of conversion or exile. The goal was clear: one country, one faith, one crown. Isabella's iron will was imposing a rigid, uncompromising order on her diverse kingdom, and the Spanish Inquisition was her ever-vigilant enforcer, ensuring that no one colored outside the very strict Catholic lines. Her Majesty's Inquisition holiday, it turned out, was a permanent state of affairs, a long, dark night of suspicion, fear, and fiery purges, all in the name of God and Queen. Chapter 13. The Concubine Who Ruled an Empire Forever. Let's whisk ourselves away from the fervent piety and smoky autodafés of Isabella's Spain and journey east, far east, to the opulent, labyrinthine world of the Qing dynasty in 19th century China. Here, amidst the silks and secrets of the Forbidden City, a young woman entered as a humble concubine and rose to become one of the most powerful figures in Chinese history, a de facto ruler for nearly half a century. Her name was Cixi, and her story is a masterclass in ambition, political savvy, and the art of not just surviving but thriving, in a court that was basically a beautiful gilded shark tank. Before we get to the coups and the alleged poisoned teacups, let's trace the incredible ascent of the woman who would be Empress Dowager. Cixi, born in 1835, wasn't exactly destined for the Dragon Throne from birth. She came from a Manchu family, the ruling ethnicity of the Qing dynasty. But her origins were relatively modest within that elite. Her journey to power began in a way that sounds like something out of a historical drama because, well, it kind of was. In 1851, at the age of 16, she was selected as a concubine for the Xianfeng Emperor. Now, being chosen for the imperial harem wasn't necessarily a ticket to glory. There were ranks upon ranks of consorts and concubines, all vying for the emperor's attention and favor. It was a world of intense competition, subtle maneuvering, and a whole lot of waiting around, hoping the emperor might glance in your direction. Think of it as the ultimate reality show, but with much higher stakes and considerably more elaborate hairdos. Cixi, however, was not one to just blend into the background. She was intelligent, literate, a significant advantage, and possessed a shrewd understanding of court politics. She also had one major ace up her sleeve. In 1856, she gave birth to the Xianfeng Emperor's only surviving son, Zaishun. In a system where producing a male heir was paramount, this was like hitting the imperial jackpot. Suddenly, Cixi, initially a lower-ranking consort, was elevated to the rank of noble consort Yi. She was no longer just another pretty face in the Forbidden City. She was the mother of the heir apparent, a position that came with significant influence and a target on her back, metaphorically speaking. Of course, mostly. The Xianfeng Emperor's reign was not a particularly happy or successful one. China was beset by internal rebellions, most notably the massive Taiping Rebellion, and encroaching foreign powers who were less than impressed with China's stay out of our imperial business policy. The emperor often ill and perhaps not the sharpest tool in the imperial shed, increasingly relied on others. Cixi, with her intelligence and proximity as the mother of his heir, began to gain his trust. It said she would help him read and comment on state documents when his health failed. This was her on-the-job training in imperial governance, an informal apprenticeship in wielding power, all while navigating the treacherous currents of court factions. When the Xianfeng Emperor died in 1861, Cixi's 5-year-old son became the Tongji Emperor. Now, a 5-year-old on the Dragon Throne is generally not going to be making a lot of key policy decisions, unless those decisions involve more nap time or stricter enforcement of bedtime. A regency council of 8 conservative Manchu ministers was appointed to rule in his name. But Cixi, now Empress Dowager Cixi, alongside Empress Dowager Xian, the late Emperor's principal wife, who was childless but held a senior rank, was not about to be sidelined. These ministers saw the two dowagers as mere figureheads, women to be respected for their titles but excluded from real power. They seriously underestimated Cixi. What followed was a textbook example of a palace coup, executed with remarkable speed and precision. Cixi, in alliance with Prince Gong, the late emperor's influential brother who had been excluded from the Regency Council, orchestrated the downfall of the 8 regents. It was called the Xinyu coup. The regents were arrested, some were executed, others forced to commit suicide or exiled. Just like that, the game changed. The 2 Empress Dowagers, Cixi and Qian, became co-regents for the young Tongji Emperor, with Prince Gong as their chief advisor. It was a brilliant, ruthless maneuver that demonstrated Cixi's political audacity and her talent for forging strategic alliances. She had gone from concubine to co-ruler of China in just over a decade. Not bad for a career change. For the next 20 years, Cixi and Qian ruled from behind the curtain, a screen separating them from their male officials during audiences, a traditional arrangement for female rulers. While Qian was generally seen as less politically inclined, Cixi was the driving force. She learned quickly, proving to be a capable and decisive leader, at least in these earlier years. She supported efforts to modernize China to some extent, a movement known as the Tongzi Restoration, which aimed to strengthen the Qing dynasty by adopting some Western technologies while preserving traditional Confucian values. Think of it as trying to upgrade the imperial operating system without changing the user interface too much. She also proved adept at managing the complex and often fractious Qing bureaucracy, playing officials off against each other, promoting loyalists, and removing those who challenged her authority. She understood the importance of appearances, of maintaining the dignity and rituals of the imperial court, even as the world outside the Forbidden City was changing rapidly and often alarmingly. Her survival in this environment was a testament to her cunning, her resilience, and her unwavering focus on consolidating and maintaining power. She wasn't just reacting to events, she was shaping them, ensuring that the reins of the empire remained firmly, if discreetly, in her hands. This period of co-regency with Xian was relatively stable, but it was always clear that Cixi was the more dominant partner. When the Tongji Emperor came of age, he proved to be a rather dissolute young man, more interested in the pleasures of the flesh than the burdens of state. His early death in 1875, without an heir, presented another crisis and another opportunity for Cixi to demonstrate her mastery of political chess. She moved swiftly to install her 3-year-old nephew as the Guangxu Emperor, ensuring that she and Xian would continue as regents. The concubine who had entered the Forbidden City with uncertain prospects was now, more than ever, the indispensable woman, the power behind the dragon throne, a position she would cling to with fierce determination for decades to come. The stage was set for an even longer and more controversial period of her rule. Chapter 14. China's Velvet Glove and Poisoned Teacup. So, Empress Dowager Cixi had successfully navigated the perilous currents of the Forbidden City, transforming herself from a teenage concubine into the most powerful woman in China, the true force behind the Dragon Throne. She'd outmaneuvered regents, installed emperors, and learned to wield power with a skill that was both admired and feared. But as any long-reigning ruler knows, getting power is one thing. Keeping it, especially for nearly half a century, often requires a more robust toolkit. Now we delve into the era where Cixi's velvet glove, often on display in her public persona as a cultured patron of the arts, was rumored to conceal an iron fist, and perhaps a strategically administered cup of something not entirely wholesome. The co-regency with Empress Dowager Xian had been a period of shared, if Cixi dominated, power. However, in 1881, Xian died suddenly. Officially, it was a stroke. Unofficially, rumors swirled, as they so often do in closed-off palaces full of ambitious people, that Cixi might have had a hand in her demise. There's no concrete proof, of course. It could have been natural causes, or it could have been that Xian, who sometimes challenged Cixi, had become an inconvenient obstacle. A conveniently timed illness can solve a lot of political problems, after all. With Xian gone, Cixi was the sole regent, the undisputed power behind the young Guangxu Emperor. When the Guangxu Emperor finally came of age in 1889, Cixi nominally retired to the summer palace, supposedly to live out her days in leisurely splendor. But retirement for Cixi was more of a strategic repositioning. She retained immense influence, a vast network of loyal officials, and a very keen interest in what her nephew, the Emperor, was up to. And what he got up to in 1898 was the 100 Days Reform. Inspired by reformist thinkers, the Guangxu Emperor launched an ambitious program to modernize China's administration, education system, and military, hoping to drag the Qing dynasty kicking and screaming into the modern world. This was radical stuff, and it threatened the deeply entrenched conservative interests of many Manchu nobles and officials, Cixi's power base. Cixi was not amused. Whether she opposed the reforms themselves, or simply the fact that they were happening without her control and threatened her authority, is a matter of debate. But her response was swift and decisive. In what was essentially another coup, she emerged from her retirement had the Guangxu Emperor declared unfit to rule and placed him under effective house arrest on a small island within the Forbidden City. Reformist officials were arrested, executed, or fled into exile. The 100 Days Reform came to a screeching halt after exactly 103 days. Cixi was back in charge, openly and absolutely. It was a stark demonstration that while emperors might reign, It was Cixi who truly ruled. Her message was clear. Reform would happen on her terms, or not at all. The imprisonment of the Guangxu emperor lasted for the rest of his life. He became a tragic figure, a ruler in name only, his hopes for a modernized China dashed by his powerful aunt. And then, in 1908, things got even more suspicious. The Guangxu emperor died. Just one day later, Cixi herself passed away. The timing was, to put it mildly, highly convenient for those who feared what might happen if the emperor outlived the aged Empress Dowager and potentially sought revenge or restarted his reforms. For decades, rumors persisted that the emperor had been poisoned, and in 2008, over a century later, forensic tests on his remains confirmed dangerously high levels of arsenic. The smoking gun, or perhaps the poisoned teacup, had finally been found. While there's no signed confession from Cixi ordering his murder, the circumstantial evidence is compelling. It's believed that, as Cixi felt her own end approaching, she couldn't bear the thought of the Guangxu emperor regaining power and undoing her legacy, or worse, punishing her allies. So, a final, ruthless act to secure the future, or at least her version of it. It was the ultimate power play from a woman who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of political survival and control. If you can't take your power with you, at least make sure your enemies don't get to enjoy it either. Beyond these high-stakes political dramas, Cixi's later reign was marked by a disastrous miscalculation. Her support for the Boxer Rebellion. Around 1900, a violent, anti-foreign, anti-Christian movement known as the Boxers was gaining momentum in northern China. Initially, the Qing court was wary, but Cixi, perhaps swayed by ultra-conservative elements at court, or perhaps seeing an opportunity to drive out the foreign powers that had been chipping away at China's sovereignty for decades, eventually threw her support behind the Boxers. This was a catastrophic decision. The Boxers, believing they were immune to foreign bullets, besieged the foreign legation quarter in Beijing. An international force from 8 nations invaded to relieve the siege, routing the imperial armies and the Boxers, and occupying Beijing. Cixi and the court were forced to flee the capital in disguise, a humiliating experience. The subsequent Boxer Protocol imposed massive indemnities on China, further crippling the already struggling Qing dynasty. Cixi's gamble had backfired spectacularly, damaging China's international standing and hindering its already slow path to modernization. It was a black mark on her long rule, a moment where her famed political shrewdness seemed to desert her, replaced by a desperate, reactionary nationalism. Yet, even after this debacle, Cixi managed to cling to power, returning to Beijing and even belatedly implementing some of the reforms she had previously suppressed. She remained the ultimate survivor. Her legacy is complex and controversial. Was she a ruthless tyrant who prioritized her own power over the good of her country, a barrier to progress whose actions hastened the fall of the Qing dynasty? Or was she a pragmatic leader navigating impossible circumstances, trying to preserve Chinese sovereignty and tradition in the face of overwhelming internal and external pressures? Perhaps she was a bit of both. What is undeniable is her extraordinary journey from concubine to the de facto Empress of China, a reign characterized by cunning ruthlessness and an unyielding grip on the reins of an empire in its twilight years. Her velvet glove could be charming, but the poisoned teacup, it seems, was always an option. Chapter 15. An Empress with Eyes on the Prize. Right. Let's bid farewell to the Qing dynasty's poisoned teacups and intricate power plays, and set our time-traveling compasses for the glittering, treacherous heart of the Byzantine Empire. We're heading to 8th century Constantinople, a city of gold, God, and endless political backstabbing. Our subject is a woman who arrived as an outsider and, through sheer ambition and a remarkable talent for outmaneuvering everyone in sight, clawed her way to the very pinnacle of power, eventually ruling the Roman Empire in her own name. Meet Irene Sarantapachina, later known as Irene of Athens. Before the really eye-watering stuff happens, and trust me, it will, let's trace her journey from an Athenian beauty to an empress, with her gaze fixed firmly on the imperial prize. Irene was born around 752 in Athens. Now, Athens in the 8th century wasn't quite the classical powerhouse it had once been. It was more of a provincial, if still respected, town within the vast Byzantine Empire. She came from a noble Greek family, the Sarantapechos clan, known for their local influence. But let's be clear, in the grand scheme of Byzantine imperial politics, Athens was a bit of a backwater. So, when young Irene, famed for her beauty, always a useful commodity in these stories, was chosen to marry Leo, the son and heir of Emperor Constantine V, it was a significant step up. Think of it as winning the imperial lottery, if the prize was a one-way ticket to the most dangerous political arena on Earth. In 769, Irene, probably still a teenager, made the journey to Constantinople and was married to Leo IV, who soon became emperor. Suddenly, she was empress consort. The Byzantine court was a world of intricate ceremony, deep religious divides, particularly over the contentious issue of iconoclasm, the worship or destruction of religious images, and factions constantly vying for influence. Irene, an Athenian outsider, had to learn to navigate these perilous waters quickly, and learn she did. She was intelligent, observant, and possessed a will of iron beneath her reportedly beautiful exterior. Now, her husband, Leo IV, was an iconoclast, meaning he was against the veneration of icons. Irene, on the other hand, hailed from Greece, a region where icon veneration was deeply entrenched. She was, by inclination and upbringing, an iconodule, a lover of icons. This fundamental disagreement would become a major theme in her life and rule. For now, as Empress consort, she had to tread carefully. She played the part of the dutiful wife, producing an heir, Constantine VI, in 771. This secured her position, as providing a successor was job number one for an empress. Leo IV didn't last terribly long. He died in 780, when their son Constantine was only 9 years old. And just like that, Irene found herself in a position of immense power, Empress Regent for her young son. This was her moment, to step out from the shadows. Of course, being a female regent in a deeply patriarchal society like Byzantium wasn't easy. There were powerful officials, military men, and assorted imperial relatives who thought they should be calling the shots. not some woman from Athens, especially one with suspect religious leanings. But Irene was more than ready for the challenge. She proved to be a shrewd and decisive ruler. One of her first major goals was to address the iconoclasm issue. She began quietly promoting iconodules to positions of power, preparing the ground for a reversal of imperial policy. This was risky. Iconoclasm had been the official stance for decades, supported by powerful elements in the army and administration. But Irene was playing the long game. She understood that religious unity, on her terms, would strengthen her position and that of her son. She faced numerous plots and conspiracies, often from her late husband's iconoclast half-brothers who fancied themselves as emperors. Irene dealt with these threats ruthlessly. Conspirators were arrested, tonsured, meaning forced into monasteries, a classic Byzantine way of neutralizing political rivals, or worse. She was demonstrating that she was not merely a placeholder for her son, but a political force in her own right. She was building her power base, carefully, methodically, and with a clear vision of what she wanted: an empire that venerated icons, and an empress who was firmly in control. Her crowning achievement during her regency was the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. This church council, carefully orchestrated by Irene, officially condemned iconoclasm and restored the veneration of icons throughout the empire. It was a massive political and religious victory for her. It healed a major schism within the church, improved relations with the Pope in Rome, for a while at least, and solidified her image as a pious and orthodox ruler. She had taken on the iconoclast establishment, and won. It was a testament to her political skill, her patience, and her unwavering determination. As her son, Constantine VI, grew older, however, things started to get a bit tense. Young Constantine, understandably, began to desire real power for himself. He was the emperor, after all. But Irene, having tasted supreme authority, was clearly reluctant to step aside. She had grown accustomed to ruling, and perhaps she doubted her son's abilities, or simply couldn't bear to relinquish the reins. There was a growing faction around Constantine, pushing him to assert his independence from his mother. The imperial court was buzzing with the inevitable power struggle between mother and son. For a while, Constantine did manage to gain the upper hand, briefly sidelining Irene. But Irene was not one to stay sidelined for long. She was too ambitious, too skilled at the game of power. Her eyes were still very much on the prize, and that prize was sole, undisputed rule. The stage was being set for a truly shocking act, one that would cement Irene's name in the annals of ruthless ambition. Chapter 16. Mother Dearest and the Blinding Light. We left Empress Irene of Athens, having successfully navigated the treacherous currents of Byzantine politics, restored the veneration of icons, and generally established herself as a formidable ruler. Her son, Constantine VI, was chafing at the bit, eager to rule in his own right, while Irene had developed quite the taste for power. The air in Constantinople was thick with tension, the kind of tension that usually precedes something rather dramatic, and in this case, utterly horrifying. Get ready, dear listeners, because we've arrived at the moment where Mother Dearest takes on a whole new and much more literal meaning in the Byzantine horror show. This is the story of how Irene secured her place as sole ruler, and the blindingly awful price her own son would pay. The power struggle between Irene and Constantine VI had been simmering for years. Constantine, pushed by his own ambitions and a coterie of supporters who resented Irene's dominance, had managed to briefly sideline his mother in 790. He was young, eager, and perhaps a little too confident in his ability to outmaneuver the woman who had been playing the Byzantine power game since before he could walk. Irene, ever the strategist, bided her time, rebuilt her alliances, and waited for an opportunity. And Constantine, bless his imperial cotton socks, soon provided one. Constantine's reign as sole emperor was not exactly a roaring success. He led some military campaigns with mixed results. More damagingly, he made a series of unpopular personal decisions. He divorced his first wife, Maria of Amnia, a wife Irene had chosen for him, and married his mistress Theodote. This caused a scandal, known as the Moechian controversy, from the Greek word for adultery, alienating powerful figures in the church and giving Irene's faction plenty of ammunition. It's never a good look when the emperor is seen as flouting religious law, especially when your mother has built her career on being a champion of orthodoxy. You could almost hear Irene saying, "I told you so," probably while sharpening her political knives. By 797, Irene decided the time was ripe to reclaim absolute power. She had cultivated support within the army and the administration, exploiting the dissatisfaction with Constantine's rule. The plan she and her co-conspirators hatched was audacious and brutal, even by the often grisly standards of Byzantine politics. It wasn't enough to depose Constantine to send him off to a monastery. No, Irene wanted to ensure he could never again challenge her rule. He had to be neutralized, permanently. And so, in August of 797, the trap was sprung. Constantine, attempting to rally support in the provinces, was ambushed and captured by his mother's supporters. He was brought back to Constantinople, a prisoner in his own capital. He was taken to the porphyry chamber in the great palace, the very room where he had been born. A detail so dripping with cruel irony, it feels like something out of a Greek tragedy, which, in a way, it was. There, on his mother's orders, Emperor Constantine VI, the legitimate ruler of the Byzantine Empire, was blinded. Let's just pause for a moment to absorb the sheer horror of that. Blinding was a common Byzantine method for rendering a rival politically incapable. The thinking was that a mutilated man, especially one blinded, could not command the respect and authority needed to be emperor. It was a fate considered by some to be worse than death, and this was inflicted by a mother upon her own son. It's one thing to outmaneuver your political opponents. It's quite another to have your own child's eyes gouged out to secure your ambition. Talk about a family feud escalating. The act itself was reportedly carried out with such brutality that Constantine either died shortly thereafter from his injuries or lingered in darkness and obscurity for a few years before succumbing. Accounts differ, but his reign was definitively over. Irene had achieved her goal. She was now, officially and unequivocally, the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, the first woman to hold that title in her own right, styling herself not as Empress Regent, but as Irene, Emperor of the Romans, using the male form of the title, she had shattered the ultimate glass ceiling, though she'd used some rather gruesome methods to do so. The reaction to this across the empire and beyond was mixed, to say the least. Many were horrified by the unnatural cruelty of a mother blinding her son. It was seen as a profound violation of both human and divine law. However, Irene still had significant support, particularly from the iconodule faction she had so carefully cultivated. They saw her as the champion of orthodoxy, the one who had restored the icons, and perhaps were willing to overlook the rather unpleasant methods she used to secure her position to continue that work. Politics, as ever, makes for strange bedfellows and even stranger justifications. One of the most significant consequences of Irene's sole rule, and the manner in which she achieved it, was its impact on the West. In the year 800, just 3 years after Constantine's blinding, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, King of the Franks, as Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. One of the justifications for this momentous act, which effectively revived the Western Roman Empire and created a new imperial power to rival Byzantium, was that the imperial throne in Constantinople was technically vacant. Since a woman could not, in the Pope's view and that of many Westerners, legitimately rule the Roman Empire, and the last male emperor had been so barbarously deposed, the title was up for grabs. Irene's coup, intended to secure her power in the East, inadvertently contributed to a major geopolitical shift in the West. Oops. Irene ruled as sole emperor for 5 years, from 797 to 802. Her reign was characterized by a continuation of her iconodule policies, some attempts at fiscal reform. She reduced taxes, which was popular, and various diplomatic maneuvers. She even, according to some chronicles, contemplated a marriage alliance with Charlemagne himself, a union that would have theoretically reunited the Eastern and Western Roman empires. Imagine that wedding. It never came to pass, probably much to the relief of many, but it shows the scale of her ambition. She wasn't just content with ruling Byzantium. She was thinking on a truly imperial, transcontinental scale. Her ambition, like her methods for dealing with her son, knew few bounds. The blinding light of her own power had perhaps obscured all other considerations. Chapter 17. From Palace Floors to Bloody Thrones. All right, let's leave the gilded halls and eye-watering betrayals of Byzantium behind us. We're now venturing back in time to the raw, chaotic, and frankly quite brutal world of 6th century Merovingian Gaul, which would one day become France. This is an era of feuding warrior kings, precarious queens, and life expectancies that were often alarmingly short, especially if you were anywhere near the throne. Our focus is a woman whose rise to power was as astonishing as it was ruthless. A former palace servant who climbed her way to the very top, leaving a trail of conveniently dead rivals in her wake. Her name was Fredegund, and her story is a stark reminder that in the game of Merovingian thrones, you won or you died, often quite messily. Before we get to her truly impressive catalogue of alleged assassinations, let's see how this ambitious servant girl first caught the king's eye and began her ascent. Fredegund enters the historical record, chiefly through the writings of Gregory of Tours, a contemporary bishop and historian who, it's fair to say, was not her biggest fan, sometime in the mid-6th century. She wasn't born to nobility, not even close. She started her career as a serving girl in the palace of King Chilperic, the first of Neustria, one of several Merovingian kingdoms that were constantly squabbling with each other. Think of Neustria as one of several gangster families in a very violent neighborhood, and Chilperic as one of its capos. Fredegund, in this analogy, started out polishing the silverware. Now, Chilperic was a man of appetites. He had a string of wives and mistresses, which was pretty standard for a Merovingian king. His first wife, Audovera, had provided him with several sons. But Audovera, it seems, was perhaps a little too trusting. Or perhaps Fredegund was just exceptionally cunning. The story goes that Fredegund, through a clever bit of trickery involving Audovera acting as godmother to her own child, which would have created a spiritual impediment to her marriage with Chilperic according to church law, managed to get Audovera repudiated and banished to a convent. With wife number 1 out of the way, Fredegund became Chilperic's mistress. Step 1 on the ladder to power, complete. Chilperic, however, then decided to make a politically advantageous marriage to Galswintha, the daughter of the Visigothic king of Spain. Galswintha came with a hefty dowry and the promise of an important alliance. This was a bit of a setback for Fredegund's ambitions. Galswintha, understandably, was not thrilled to find her new husband still very much attached to his rather Maelite the Nar, charming, and clearly ambitious servant turned mistress, she complained. She wanted Fredegund sent away. She probably made Chilperic's life a bit miserable. Big mistake. One morning, not long after the wedding, Queen Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. Surprise. Surprise. Gregory of Tours, and pretty much everyone else, pointed the finger squarely at Chilperic and strongly implied that Fredegund was the one whispering in his ear, or perhaps even more directly involved. With Galswintha conveniently out of the picture, and her dowry presumably remaining in Chilperic's coffers, Chilperic was now free to marry Fredegund, and so the former palace servant became Queen of Neustria. It was a truly meteoric rise, from scrubbing floors to wearing a crown, all in a remarkably short space of time. It just goes to show what a bit of ambition, ruthlessness, and a conveniently dead rival or two can do for one's career prospects. This, however, set the stage for one of the most epic and bloody feuds in Merovingian history. Galswintha had a sister, a rather formidable woman named Brunhilde. Brunhilde had married Chilperic's brother, Sigebert I, the king of Austrasia, Neustria's main rival kingdom. Brunhilde was, to put it mildly, incandescent with rage over her sister's murder and Fredegund's subsequent elevation. She demanded vengeance, and Sigebert was more than happy to oblige, seeing an opportunity to settle some scores with his brother Chilperic. Thus began a decades-long vendetta between these two queens, Fredegund and Brunhilde, a rivalry that would see husbands, sons, and countless others slaughtered in a seemingly endless cycle of violence and retribution. It was like a royal soap opera, but with real axes and a much higher body count. Fredegund, now queen, was determined to secure her position and, Crucially, the succession for her own children with Chilperic. This meant dealing with any potential rivals, including Chilperic's sons from his first wife, Odovera. According to Gregory of Tours, Fredegund was relentless. One son, Theudebert, was killed in battle. Another, Merove, made the mistake of marrying Brunhilde, yes, his aunt by marriage and his stepmother's mortal enemy. Merovingian family trees are a tangled mess, and rebelling against his father. He was eventually betrayed and killed, some say on Fredegund's orders, or even that he asked his servant to kill him to avoid falling into her hands. A third son, Clovis, was accused by Fredegund of involvement in the murder of her own infant sons, who died of dysentery, a common killer at the time, and was subsequently assassinated, conveniently again. Fredegund seemed to possess an uncanny ability to eliminate anyone who stood in her way, or in the way of her children inheriting the throne. She was described as beautiful, intelligent, and utterly without scruple. She built her power base within Chilperic's court, rewarding her loyalists and ensuring that the king remained devoted to her, despite the chaos and bloodshed that seemed to follow her everywhere. She was fighting for survival in a brutal world, and she was using every weapon at her disposal, from her feminine charms to, allegedly, the assassin's dagger and the poison cup. The palace floors she once scrubbed were now a stage for her bloody intrigues, as she transformed herself into a queen whose name would become synonymous with terror. The full extent of her alleged murderous career was yet to unfold, but the foundations of her reign of fear were well and truly laid. Chapter 18. Neustria's Queen of Assassins. We left Fredegund firmly established as Queen of Neustria, having clawed her way up from servitude, leaving a few conveniently deceased obstacles in her wake. Her marriage to King Chilperic was secure, and her bitter rivalry with Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia was in full, bloody swing. Fredegund had already shown a certain flair for direct action in securing her position. But as the years went by, the accusations against her would pile up, painting a portrait of a queen whose primary tools of statecraft appeared to be the dagger, the poison, and the well-placed assassin. This wasn't just about political maneuvering anymore. This was, according to her chroniclers, a reign of terror orchestrated by Neustria's veritable queen of assassins. Gregory of Tours, our main and admittedly very biased source for Fredegund's exploits, details a seemingly endless string of murders and attempted murders, either ordered by or directly implicating her. It's like she had a problem-solution flowchart, and the solution almost invariably involved someone ending up dead. Her primary targets were, naturally, her great rival Brunhilde and Brunhilde's family. For decades, these two queens were locked in a Smertelnia, deadly struggle, using their husbands, sons, and kingdoms as pawns in their personal vendetta. In 575, Fredegund allegedly sent assassins, young men armed with poisoned daggers called scramasacs, a sort of signature Merovingian weapon, to murder Brunhilde's husband, King Sigebert of Austrasia. They succeeded, striking him down just as he was on the verge of crushing Chilperic and Fredegund. With Sigebert dead, Brunhilde was captured, but she eventually escaped and continued the fight on behalf of her young son, Childebert II. The assassination of Sigebert was a masterstroke for Fredegund. It saved her kingdom and eliminated a major threat, at least for a while. It also poured about a tanker load of gasoline on her feud with Brunhilde. But Fredegund didn't just aim high. No one who crossed her path or threatened her ambitions seemed safe. Bishops who displeased her, like Praetextatus of Rouen, who had officiated at the marriage of her troublesome stepson Merovech to Brunhilde, found themselves on her hit list. Praetextatus was eventually stabbed while celebrating Mass in his own cathedral, an act of sacrilege that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the Merovingian era. Gregory of Tours recounts a dramatic deathbed confrontation, where the dying bishop directly accused Fredegund of orchestrating his murder. Fredegund, naturally, denied everything with the kind of wide-eyed innocence only a truly accomplished villain can muster. Her own husband, King Chilperic, wasn't entirely safe from her machinations. If he displeased her, or if she suspected him of wavering, though he seemed genuinely devoted to her, or at least thoroughly intimidated. There were moments. However, it was Chilperic's own assassination in 584 that is one of the great unsolved mysteries of Fredegund's career. He was stabbed by an unknown assailant after a hunt. Who was responsible? Some suspected Brunhilde, seeking revenge. Others whispered that Fredegund herself had him killed, perhaps fearing he was about to repudiate her, or perhaps to secure the regency for her young son, Clothar II, who was then only a few months old. The evidence against Fredegund in Chilperic's murder is purely circumstantial, but given her track record, she was certainly a prime suspect on everyone's list. Being Fredegund, she didn't waste time mourning. She immediately seized the royal treasure, holed up in a cathedral in Paris for sanctuary, and began maneuvering to protect herself and ensure her infant son's succession. This was a perilous time. Without Chilperic's protection, she was vulnerable. But Fredegund was nothing if not a survivor. She managed to cut a deal with Guntram, King of Burgundy, Chilperic's other brother, who became protector of young Clothar and, by extension, Fredegund. Even with Guntram's uneasy protection, Fredegund continued to be implicated in plots. She allegedly sent a cleric to assassinate Brunhilde. He failed. She was accused of trying to kill Brunhilde's son, King Childebert II, on multiple occasions, using everything from poisoned drinks to bewitched assassins. One particularly lurid tale involves her sending 2 clerics armed with poisoned knives to kill Childebert, instructing them to get close by pretending to have important news. When that failed, she supposedly had their hands and feet cut off for their incompetence. Employee motivation techniques were clearly different back then. It wasn't just external enemies. Fredegund was also accused of eliminating threats within her own court. Nobles who opposed her, officials she distrusted. Even, according to some interpretations of Gregory's highly critical accounts, her own daughter Riganth. Riganth was betrothed to a Visigothic prince and sent off with a massive dowry. When her convoy was attacked and looted, possibly due to her father, Chilperic's recent death, Riganth returned home. Gregory paints a picture of intense animosity between Fredegund and Riganth, culminating in Fredegund allegedly trying to crush her daughter's head with the lid of a heavy treasure chest. Riganth was saved by attendants, but it's a chilling story of maternal cruelty, if true. Of course, Gregory of Tours was hardly an impartial observer. and his accounts are likely colored by his deep dislike for Fredegund. Despite the constant plotting and the ever-present threat of assassination, both giving and receiving, Fredegund endured. She successfully protected her son, Clothar II, navigating treacherous political alliances and outliving many of her enemies. She died in her bed in 597, something of a rare achievement for Merovingian royalty, especially one with her reputation. Her son Clothar went on to eventually reunite the Frankish kingdoms, in no small part due to his mother's ruthless determination to secure his inheritance. Fredegund's legacy is that of the ultimate evil queen of the Merovingian Dark Ages, a beautiful, cunning, and utterly pitiless woman who carved out a kingdom for her son through a relentless campaign of seduction, intrigue, and above all, assassination. Whether she was truly as monstrous as Gregory of Tours painted her, or simply a product of an exceptionally brutal age, her name remains a byword for murderous ambition. Epilogue: The Shadow of Their Thrones. And so, dear friends, that brings us to the close of our unsettling journey through the lives and reigns of some of history's most formidable and feared women. Before you extinguish the last flickering candle and surrender to the quiet of the night, let's together briefly retrace the blood-stained path of their extraordinary and often terrifying ascents to power, a journey whose dark echoes still whisper through the corridors of time. From the icy ramparts of Hungarian castles to the perfumed treachery of the French court, from the sun-scorched ambitions of Spain to the ancient imperial city of Constantinople and the dragon-guarded secrets of the Forbidden City, we've witnessed how these women, often starting from positions of relative obscurity or vulnerability, the unwanted princess, the foreign bride, the lowly concubine, the palace servant, seized the reins of power with an audacity that shocked their contemporaries and continues to fascinate us. Their youths were often crucibles, forging ambition from adversity, teaching them early the precariousness of power and the ruthlessness required to hold it. Returning to the courts that would become their hunting grounds, these future queens shrewdly navigated labyrinths of intrigue. They mastered the art of manipulation, their charm a silken glove over an iron fist. Alliances were forged in whispers and sealed with vows, sometimes sacred, often sinister. They outmaneuvered powerful rivals, dismantled regency councils, and turned potential threats into stepping stones, or, more frequently, into entries in the court necrology. Their methods were diverse, yet shared a common thread of chilling expediency: the strategic accusation, the convenient illness, the swift coup, the public ordeal, the whisper campaign that destroyed reputations before the assassin destroyed the rival. The poisoned chalice and the hidden dagger were as much a part of their royal regalia as any crown. Their reigns, once consolidated, often through acts that would make a Borgia blush, the blinding of a sun, the orchestration of a massacre, the systematic elimination of entire bloodlines, showcased their iron will. Some sought to impose a terrifying religious or political uniformity, their fervor leaving trails of scorched earth and exiled populations. Others wielded secret police like a personal shadow army, crushing dissent with brutal efficiency. For many, paranoia became a constant companion, as the fear they instilled in others festered within their own hearts, leading to ever more desperate acts to maintain their grip on a power they had sacrificed so much, and so many, to obtain. As their power solidified, so too did their legends. They became the Bloody Marys, the Serpent Queens, the She-Wolves, figures of both dread and a perverse kind of awe. Their courts hummed with an undercurrent of fear, their beauty or piety often a deceptive mask for an unyielding ruthlessness. They launched persecutions, initiated purges, and sometimes, in their desperate ambition or cold calculation, pushed their realms into conflict and chaos. The question lingers: were they monsters born of ambition, or were they products of brutal ages, forced to adopt even more brutal methods to survive and thrive in male-dominated worlds that would have crushed lesser spirits? Their unprecedented power and the tyrannical means often used to achieve and maintain it sealed their infamous legacies. Many died in their beds, surprisingly, while others faced violent ends or lonely exiles. But their actions echoed far beyond their graves, shaping the destinies of their nations, for better, or more often, for worse. They sought to restore order, to unify kingdoms, to secure dynasties, but the price was often a landscape of fear, oppression, and the haunting memory of their evil schemes. The black legends they cultivated, or had cultivated for them, proved as enduring as any monument of stone. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of evil queens and their evil schemes. We hope these remarkable, if chilling stories have been a suitably unsettling companion as your day winds down. If you enjoyed our journey into the darker side of history, please do consider liking, subscribing, and perhaps leaving a comment with your thoughts, or even a suggestion for which notorious figures we might dare to explore next. Until then, sleep well, if you can. We look forward to welcoming you to our next dark narrative.